Siddhartha Gautama was born sometime around 560 BCE, but most of the early Buddhist art and texts that have survived date from later to around the dawn of the Common or Christian era. Buddhism spread across northern India and into Central Asia and China along the Silk Road. This was a caravan route that brought silks and other Chinese trade goods such as glass, lacquer, and ceramics from China west of the Roman Empire and later to Christian Europe, and also introduced Roman and Greek art to parts of Asia. At this point, Buddhism also broke into two different strands. Theravada Buddhism roughly translates into lesser vehicle, but really it involves a focus on individual spirituality. This form of Buddhism would travel south into what is today Sri Lanka and then into Southeast Asia, especially Thailand. These are still the two most Buddhist nations in the world, unless one counts Tibet, which is politically and reluctantly now part of China. But at this time, a new branch of Buddhism began to develop in Gandhara, known as Mahayana, or the Greater Vehicle. It's also known as Bodhisattvana, or the Bodhisattva Vehicle, because Buddhists in this tradition began to venerate bodhisattvas. This shift in emphasis also reflected a new focus on communal enlightenment, even communal salvation, as opposed to individual enlightenment. You've already encountered bodhisattvas, or enlightened beings, who choose not to enter nirvana yet, but instead to stay on earth and help others achieve enlightenment. Because bodhisattvas have chosen to remain in the world, they are often dressed ornately, as you can see from these images from Gandhara. You should also note again the Hellenistic and Roman influences in the drapery and curly hair. Mahayana Buddhism also developed a more theistic version of Buddhism with multiple Buddhas, historical Buddhas or the Shakyamuni, as well as Buddhas that had earlier entered nirvana and various celestial Buddhas who were already in nirvana, even from the future. Nirvana itself was transformed from a concept of emptiness or escape from suffering to a kind of paradise that would be more familiar to traditional Islamic and Christian thinking. This Gandharan frieze shows a Buddhist paradise. So the central Buddha has been elevated to an otherworldly being, one who has achieved nirvana. He's surrounded by what's called a Buddha field. That is a realm of influence created by the Buddha himself, his aura, if you will. On the upper right, we see a Shakyamuni Buddha, that is again the original Buddha, seated in the wilderness, pointing out this paradise to a figure kneeling before him. The central Buddha's hands are held in the Dharmachakra mudra, which again represents the Buddha's teaching about the great wheel of Dharma. He's surrounded by numerous bodhisattvas and a few worshippers. As Buddhism moved east into China along the Silk Road, it was this more theistic, more communal Mahayana form of Buddhism that took hold. It was simply better adapted to Chinese culture and Chinese realities. Buddhism indeed faced some obstacles in China, obstacles that the Mahayana form of Buddhism more easily overcame. First, and this is very important, the Chinese had no tradition of samsara. So a religion focused on overcoming the burden of continuous reincarnation didn't really make a lot of sense to the Chinese. It didn't resonate. Moreover, initially Buddhism was very individually oriented, focused, as Theravada Buddhism still does, on an individual's self-overcoming, entering into nirvana. But Confucian society was much more focused on social relationships, not on individual self-realization. It was also very hierarchical, with the elderly having considerable power over the youngsters and with ancestors reigning over all. You may recall that the original Shakyamuni Buddha, Siddhartha, was in many ways rebelling against the extreme hierarchical system in India, the caste system and the Brahmins. But in China, hierarchy was very strong. Also, to the extent that Chinese culture looked to past lives, it looked not to earlier incarnations, but to ancestors. So, this new form of Buddhism, with its emphasis on great bodhisattvas and a much more hierarchical paradise, proved more congenial to the Chinese. Another Chinese religious tradition, however, fit in better with Buddhism than the Confucianism that I've just been describing, this respect for the elders and the hierarchical communal society. Taoism, and I'm really grossly oversimplifying, but it's basically a religion of unity created by an equilibrium of opposites, yin and yang. We still talk about those, and they're shown by these familiar symbols here on your left. The principle of yin and yang sees the world as filled with complementary forces, action and non-action, light and dark, hot and cold. Taoism also focuses on unity within nature, on a relationship with nature in a way that puts a person into harmony with his or her environment. These were all religious values that integrated well with Buddhism and were really absorbed into Mahayana Buddhism. Taoism had a major impact on Chinese art, especially on Chinese landscape paintings. Here are a couple of examples. Note the almost mystical remote mountains, but also the detailed depiction of natural phenomena. Again, Chinese Buddhists would embrace this form of landscaping painting and in many ways the Taoist vision of union with nature. Here's another example of Taoist landscape painting. And here's a Chinese Buddhist painting, which clearly shows the influence of Taoism. We see Buddha under the Bodhi tree. Again, you see a focus on nature, but now the Buddha has taken a central place in the art. Buddhism benefited in China, as it had in India, from arriving at a time of great political and social upheaval when, frankly, people were looking for new religious answers. I hope you still remember the warlike Qin dynasty, very short. Its founder, really only emperor, was Shi Huang, who built the first Great Wall of China and was buried with that wonderful huge terracotta army. His brief but powerful unifying dynasty was succeeded, I'm skipping over some interregnum, by the Han Dynasty, which ruled China from around 200 BCE to 200 CE. The Hanyers were prosperous, and they saw the creation of a great deal of great art that we are not, alas, going to study in this course. During the Han Dynasty, it was Confucian philosophy that dominated China, and the result was a stable hierarchical society, and it was also a prosperous society. But this fell apart for 3.5 centuries as China was divided into competing states. The emperors of one of these states, the Northern Wei, adopted Buddhism as their state religion. When the Tang Dynasty reunified much of China in around 600 CE, its emperors also adopted Buddhism and really used Buddhism to help uphold and support their claim to rule. And they would rule for 300 years. So the Northern Wei and Tang dynasties were the heyday of Buddhism and Buddhist art in China. So we're looking at a period that would have been the early Middle Ages, really what we call the Dark Ages in Europe. Just to kind of keep your time frame straight, that's where we're heading in our history, by the way. Again, the troubled times of the period of disunity following the disintegration of the Han Dynasty proved ripe for a new religious message. So this is a gilded statue of the Shakyamuni. Remember what that is? It's the historical Buddha. And this is the oldest Chinese Buddhist image that has survived, or at least that we know of now. And it fits Chinese Buddhist texts that describe the Buddha as golden and radiating light. Note that this Buddha still closely resembles the Buddha of Gandhara, especially in the concentric or circular symmetrical folds of the robe. The addition of the gold, though, and the focus on a somewhat more heavenly Buddha is moving more toward a Chinese style of Buddhism. And there's the Gandhara Buddha. I couldn't find an internet image of the meeting of the two Buddhas from your textbook. That's figure 711. But this carved marble stela, which was gilded with gold, depicts the same scene and comes from the same Northern Wei era, around 500 CE. This artwork shows two Buddha figures sitting side by side. They represent the Shakyamuni Buddha, again, the historical Buddha, and a Buddha of the past, flanked by 2 monks with rows of dragons supporting a stupa, remember, a reliquary, as well as heavenly beings called asparas, which are holding garlands. Notice the images of heaven or paradise have become much more important to Buddhism. Before I talk about these images from the Longmen Caves in China, you should watch this video clip from the Asian Art Museum to get a feeling for the entire complex and the monumental size. This was another thing that characterized Chinese Buddhism, perhaps partly because it tended to be associated with rulers and not just with ordinary people seeking enlightenment. These rulers, in part to shore up their own regime, show their own importance, erected monumental Buddhist art. I've already mentioned the Tang Dynasty's support for Buddhism. One form this took, again, was construction of these huge monuments that then became pilgrimage sites for Buddhists. The Longmen Cave complex was built largely in the 5th century CE at Luanyang in central China, the city where, according to either history or legend, Buddhism first arrived in China with 2 monks from India. Some of this was built under the Northern Way, some under the succeeding Tang dynasty, and perhaps the most famous Tang ruler and a major patron of this complex was the Empress Wu Zetian. She was the Hatshepsut of China, and she personally paid for much of this complex. Her reign was under some question, and like Hatshepsut, she used art to reinforce her claim to rule. Note the complex features multiple Buddhas in the Chinese Mahayana tradition. The central Buddha is the cosmic Buddha, or Vairocana Buddha, the Buddha of boundless time and space. This is an eternal Buddha. On either side of the Buddha are bodhisattvas and other guardian figures. Again, this is communal Buddhism and a Buddhism focused on eternal salvation. Let me say a word about pronunciation. Last year, I received some pronunciation corrections on my Buddhist art podcast. I've tried to look up pronunciations this time, but I get different answers from different sources, so I'm probably not going to make everybody happy. Sorry. Here's another important Buddha representing another Chinese sect of Mahayana Buddhism, the Amitabha. This image is not in your book, but it's also from the Longmen Caves complex. Amitabha, or the Buddha of the West, was the focal point of another strand of Buddhism called Pure Land Buddhism. In this strand or branch of Buddhism, and by the way, I think this is interesting, this is probably the most common form of Buddhism found in Asian communities in the United States. This form of Buddhism rejects the idea that individuals can achieve nirvana or enlightenment on their own. Instead, enlightenment is a free gift of the Amitabha Buddha, available to all who accept this gift and chant his name. I don't know if Buddhism had a Martin Luther, but this sounds like a Lutheranism, if you will, come to Buddhism. At any rate, those who accept the free gift from the Amitabha Buddha will be reborn in the Pure Land, heaven in the West, a paradise that is free from corruption. By the way, if you're interested in hearing Amitabha mantras chanted, go to YouTube, look for Amitabha, and you will have lots to choose from. Here's another image of the Amitabha, or Pure Land paradise. This one is in your book. It's a wall painting done on silk. Note the sumptuous palace setting, reflecting the wealth of the sponsoring Tang dynasty. This is not austere Buddhism. This is Buddhism of the ruling class. Amitabha sits on the center of a raised platform surrounded by bodhisattvas and other attendants. They're watching a celestial dance. Interestingly, even sinners could enter Amitabha's paradise. I'm guessing this increased the attractiveness of this particular form of Buddhism. It's hard to see on the slide, but sinners are portrayed as sitting within closed lotus buds. They're waiting to open when they receive the Amitabha's teaching. And here's still another image of the Amitabha, or Pure Land paradise. This one's actually from a couple of centuries earlier, from a cave temple, and it shows a more traditional Buddhist depiction of the paradise scene. Again, it's easier to get a sense of this treasure trove of Chinese art and of the scale of some of these treasures by looking at a video. This video clip is from UNESCO, which is the United Nations chief cultural agency. One of the most characteristic forms of Tang Buddhist art is the pagoda temple. Notice the distinctive curved roof line, the grid of beams, and the overhanging eaves. Pagodas are easy to recognize. Here's a larger view of the 9-story octagonal pagoda you just saw. Like stupas, these pagoda temples housed relics as well as sacred images and texts. They're really the Chinese form. This last video clip is the second part of a Lonely Planet video on Luoyang. It shows the oldest Buddhist temple site in China, the White Horse Temple. The building you will see has been rebuilt many times, and the current version is actually much smaller than the magnificent original. But I like the way this gives you a picture of current Chinese Buddhist worship as well as of the buildings. And here you see the main temple, the White Horse Temple, and the classic pagoda form with those curved decorated roof lines. Here's another Tang Dynasty work, although this painting is really more Confucian than Buddhist in its inspiration, particularly with its focus on scholarship. This portrays the emperor surrounded by scholars, showing that the emperor is himself a learned man. Note you see hierarchy of scale. The emperor is larger than the scholars. This is from the next dynasty, the Song, and again, it's really a Taoist work, but I just couldn't resist including it because I love Taoist landscape art and thought it was beautiful. This, however, is a Buddhist work. In my final Buddhism lecture, I'm going to be talking more about Chan, or to use the Japanese term, Zen Buddhism. One of its teachings is especially well represented by this Chinese broken ink painting. This school of Buddhism believed that even performing very ordinary tasks could bring enlightenment, and that this enlightenment usually occurred very suddenly as Buddhists were performing very simple acts. In this work, the 6th Chan or Zen patriarch is shown receiving enlightenment as he chops bamboo. Note the very simple style and varied brushstrokes. This is what characterizes the broken ink style. Arhats are really another form of bodhisattva. They have achieved freedom from rebirth by suppressing all earthly desire, and now they're charged with protecting the Buddhist law until the Buddha of the future arrives. So note, we have Buddhas of the past, we have the historic Buddha, we have Buddha of the future, we have cosmic Buddha, and there are in fact many more. Notice here again you see hierarchy of scale and the very different representation of the Arhats and the poor beggars, and this landscape also shows Taoist influences. Although Buddhists recognize hundreds of Arhats, the standard number depicted in temples is 18. These are original followers of the Buddha who have achieved nirvana and are awaiting the return to earth of Maitreya. Maitreya is a bodhisattva who in the Buddhist tradition is to appear on earth, achieve complete enlightenment, teach the pure Dharma, and essentially usher in worldwide enlightenment. According to the scriptures, Maitreya will be a successor of the historic Shakyamuni Buddha. No, you do not have to keep all these Buddhas straight, but you should be aware that they exist in the religion and are portrayed in the art. Korea embraced Buddhism in the 7th century when the Silla dynasty rulers converted. This granite Buddha is 11 feet tall, so again you see a tradition of monumental Buddhism associated with the ruling class. It sits in a rotunda also built of granite. This statue offers a good illustration, by the way, of the earth-touching or earth witness mudra. The Buddha's hand points toward the earth. Do you remember the story behind this mudra? Your AP grader would be impressed if you used one of these images and told the story. Besides, it's a great story. Devils, temptation, scary woman, voices from on high. And with that bit of enlightenment, I'm going to close this lecture. In my final lecture, I will explore the art of Buddhist Japan and Southeast Asia.